I'm going to talk about nature reserve creation, and basically the take-home message is that we should be looking at all of these projects as land purchase, protection, and sustainability as sort of three components. Hold on, there we go. So just a little bit of my background. I've been working with ABC for the last 10 years now with Brazil projects. I'm a Brazil program coordinator. That's half time. And then the other half the time, I work with Asociación Armonía in Bolivia. And part of my job is the reserves, sustainability reserve supervision. So I've been put in this weird position where at one side, I'm practically trying to manage a reserve and make it sustainable. And on the other side, I'm trying to help Brazilian partners in making their reserve sustainable. So it's got me thinking about a lot of these elements. I must admit that through my time, I've become quite a proponent of reserves. I've seen the benefit of owning the land and being able to take things in control. These are some of these things people used to talk about, and I used to sort of think they were not silly, but you know, these don't really have an impact. This isn't really a problem in conservation. Once you have a reserve, you start learning that it's amazing the little minute input that these things have that can cause a lot of damage. And one of the big ones for me has been the ecological nightmare of persistent burning. And this is something that I'm hearing this a lot nowadays, that people are saying, oh, well, habitat is fire resistant, so that's okay if there's burning. But it's all about the amount of burning. And when you're burning yearly, it's incredibly destructive. Also, the fact that at the moment you have a reserve, this is in our Barbaso Nature Reserve, and I'll be coming back to this quite a few times, all of a sudden you start planning. All of a sudden you realize you own this for the next 100, 300, 7 generations. And so the program changes from thinking yearly to thinking 10 years ahead, 20 years ahead. This is an exclusion zone, and these kind of things that we won't probably get results from this for about 10 years, but it's worth the investment because we know what we could see in the future, and we know we'll own it, we'll be there. And also just sort of you see your impact. We're looking at an area that was cleared, you know, coming back quite radically, and then we're getting threatened species. This is the marsh deer showing up, and just wonderful, the impact of these long-term conservation measures. And also part of the reserve, just to talk about it, but I've realized the importance of buffer zones and how you know, we talk about buffer zones, but the real reality of a buffer zone in your planning that for example, you know, if you could go around trying to stop everyone, all your neighbors from hunting, you know, 200 meters into your reserve, or just sort of say that's a buffer zone and understand that there's going to be a bit of hunting, but it's far better that than having you fighting with them all the time. Also pesticide drift is also a problem. So just when I got to Bolivia, this is a map of Bolivia and the protected areas in Bolivia. And I started working in a park called Mabidi National Park. And this was a park that was created by very large NGOs that went to the government and told them they just have to protect this land. It's so important. The government, you know, signed this thing and made it the biggest park in Bolivia. I think it's 1 million hectares. And then they left. And then they didn't, no one paid for it. And right now in Bolivia, you have sort of an anti-park stance by the government, because the parks are seen as just a drain on the economy, and what does the country get from the parks? And this is sort of a theme we want to avoid. I got one of these from this photo from the internet, but when I started going to Brazil, I started noticing the same kind of situation. I went to one reserve that was created and had a budget to build a nursery and everything. But I was there 5 years later, and there was no park guard. The nursery had all fallen apart. The trails were all covered over, and they had no money. They had no idea how they were going to pay for it. There's another reserve in Brazil where I went, and it was basically a park guard and no transportation. And that person sort of lived there on the reserve. And basically the board to the NGO said, we're not buying any more land because it's just draining us. It's a constant cost that we can't cover. This is a picture of the hummingbird garden at Serra do Urubu in Brazil. This is a feature we help support to bring in tourists. And so someone could say, well, you know, the reason that's the problem is because the NGO didn't plan very well, and they should have thought clear in the future. But I think we have to understand also, you know, when we're talking about these land purchase reserve creation projects, that a lot of these NGOs, 90% of their money comes from sending out proposals. And those proposals, 90% of them, you never get told why they failed. You just, and sometimes you don't get told they failed. You just wait, and then you realize, okay, I guess they're not supporting us because they never got back to us. So we are trained, and my hat is Armonia, to be very competitive, to keep our budgets low, and to make sure everything's kind of sexy, because we might not get support otherwise. So that's when we come to a land purchase, we've got that sort of mentality that we have to, you know, we have to shoot for the low end. And then the other part of it is when you're doing land purchase, for many of these NGOs, all of a sudden these budgets are enormous. And this is something that is scary and makes you not, I mean, you're passionate, you really want to purchase this land. And so you don't want to add in anything else that might lose the chance for you to win this amazing opportunity to protect this forest, this area. So again, there's the partner, the on-ground group has the thought of trying to keep it as cheap as possible to make sure they can win this enormous proposal that they can't imagine someone would actually support them. So that's just a bit of background there. And sort of an element that I found with a unsustainable nature reserve, you have certain people, individuals, there can be organizations that really want to support you. They really like what your organization is doing, and they would support almost anything your organization wants because they understand that you're working hard, you're passionate, you're working on your priorities. But when you have an unsustainable reserve, you constantly have all these costs like not very attractive costs, park guards, fuel, parts for a vehicle. And so it's these people who love your organization who are the ones you can sort of depend on to help cover those holes that other organizations won't support. But if you weren't in that situation, those kind of people would be the people that might start, would support a urgent project in another area where the species is disappearing, which might be a little brown bird or mammal that no one really cares about, but it's important. Anyway, starting a new initiative. So if we're looking at the big picture of conservation and helping everything in nature, we really want for those people who are dedicated to those groups for those funds not to be going to sustainability of a nature reserve. So I saw organizations in Brazil with problems with reserve sustainability, and I decided to put together a workshop talking about sustainability, where we would all come together. This is 4 different reserves that ABC had supported, and discuss how we could create a sustainability plan for these reserves. They were Oasis Sararipe, Serra do Urubu, Mato do Passarinho, and Serra do Bonita. We came together, discussed it. The meeting was very valuable. It was 3 days. And I remember planning, thinking, I don't know what we're going to talk about for 3 days. And they had so much to talk amongst themselves, so many experiences that they had in trying to cover a reserve costs, that it sort of moved me to do something more. So at the time that we did this meeting, we had it in the Oasis Araripe, which is run by Aquasis, and the director was Alberto Campos. And so Alberto Campos, there's the authors there, Alberto, Lucia, myself, and Mark. Alberto came to me and said, do you realize that this information of that workshop isn't really available? It's not out there at all. And he, because of COVID, was doing his doctoral thesis, and so had to sort of stay home, couldn't do field work. And we came up with this idea of putting together the guide that you have, and you can download it. If you write Sustainable Nature Reserves, ABC, American Bird Conservancy, there's a page there where you can download the PDF for the book. It's free. So the book we put together, thinking a checklist, what you need to do on each subject. We also surveyed 54 reserves that are ongoing right now, international reserves. We also got some professional opinions on certain different areas, and then a subject on how to do this. And then we sort of looked at the book. I'm not going to go through the whole book here. That's not the point, but I'm just going to cover a few areas here. But thinking of an organization or a person or an indigenous reserve or indigenous area or community that wants to create a reserve, what are the stages they need to sort of go through to create a sustainable, economically sustainable reserve? So, first looking at their motives, looking at their group, or how they're found, are they legal, et cetera. And that's all in the book. The sustainability, also looking at sort of a natural sustainability of an ecosystem, and then your budget, your sustainability plan, creating the proposal, community engagement, restoration, management tools. So part of the results of the survey, this is one we should all notice and be a bit alarmed about. So these 54 reserves, 25 of them every year have to raise the money to cover the cost of their reserve. And what that tells me is that they're doing probably the minimal possible in their protection. I bet you they have lots of extra projects they want to do, but they have to worry about raising park guards, raising money for gas, raising money for fixing the tractor, fixing the Jeep. And then another 16 are mostly dependent on continuous fundraising. And then you get another 7 that are HOF. So 76% of these are not economically sustainable. And you could argue that 89% of these are not sustainable on the sustainable plan. Meaning, if a crisis happens, well, they might really suffer. And I think we've seen this through COVID. I think we might actually talk to people how they survived COVID. What is sustainability? We talk about forever. I like how this minivan in Bolivia, they quantified it forever as 1,000 years. What is forever? The Iroquois Nation, 7 generations. How you can argue what is sustainable, but what we're looking at is suggesting a model where first of all, you divide your resources. So you have multiple areas where you can get funding. And then you've got programs that should every year bring in funding without you having to sort of do the fundraising effort. So obviously tourism, for example, once you get tourism going, they'll come the next year without you having to sort of sit down and do, search for more tourists. And endowments are another idea. And I'll just touch endowment just here, and I'm going to go more into this a bit later on the different elements of what's sustainability. But I remember when I first was talking about reserves and endowments, and people were very negative on it and saying, oh, it doesn't work anymore, and people don't want to support it, and it's very costly. But endowment doesn't have to cover the entire cost of a reserve. It could be just a bit of money that covers the park guards. And it's a bit of safe money. You know how endowments work. But it doesn't mean if you don't have $1 million to put in your endowment, there's no point in doing it. $100,000 can be valuable as an endowment to cover a certain element and to be a piece of sort of the pie there. So this is our reserve in Bolivia. This was in 2019. This is not sustainable. If NMBCA drops out on us, we're going to have some trouble. And one of these grants has dropped off in the last years. But what we've done is sort of projected where we want to go, and we're working towards this. And I don't know who said this once, but they said you measure conservation in decades. And I found that to be very true, especially with the reserve. I think we have about 4 more years to go until we should be sustainable, and it will have taken us 10 years. But again, this is, we're looking at different chunks of the pie. If tourism falls out on us, we'll be okay because we'll be able to cover it with other things. We could fundraise for it. And something that, and I've just sort of made this up as another example of what would be an ideal, I think, pie for sustainability, and that you can have an element that you fundraise for every year. And what I recommend on that is you have a contingency fund, and that same amount covers that. So at least if you can't raise the money, you've got your contingency fund there that should cover that. But definitely a contingency fund should be part of your pie. So I don't know if you guys are hearing, but there's all these tree planting projects and everything. And now I've heard twice sort of people proclaiming, and someone gave me an amazing, it was something like 10% of the trees lived in a British highway tree planting program. But now they're sort of just saying, well, how many trees are alive? I don't care about how many you planted, how many are alive? And I wonder if that's sort of what we're going to have in the future with our reserves, that, how many of these reserves are actually sustainable? How many are doing the job of protection that we said they would do when we started them? So it's something we should be aware of and be responsible for as well. So I'm saying, very simply, a sustainable nature reserve process should be clearly a land purchase, and beside that, protection, and then sustainability. And so that really, everything we're doing when we think about a reserve, we should be thinking about purchasing the land, yes, protecting the land, and making sure it's sustainable. And that each one is sort of an equal part in the long-term conservation of these sites. In the book, we've listed through surveys, this is a list of the costs when they buy a reserve. I would put this under protection. When I write proposal, whatever, I no longer say reserve management, because that's not very attractive, but the same thing as reserve protection, and that sounds a lot better. So these are all reserve protection elements. Here's a list that, pretty much, I bet you every reserve you purchase has 4 or 5 items on this list. And you can see a few of the sustainability elements. We also have scoured every reserve possible and every idea out there. This is the list of things that you can do to try to pay for your reserve, your sustainability. And part of what we're sort of suggesting in the book, and as a donor body, as a funder, that we should understand that some of these ideas, some of them are very new, and they might end in failure. They might not work. But it's definitely worth it trying some of these ideas, especially when you have them working another one. And I just had, in the workshop we did, I brought environmental services, and the Brazilians responded that in Brazil, it doesn't really work. People don't pay for water. It's not a thing they should pursue. And we had a very good argument from an Ecuador project that showed that it could be quite a good method. And now I've just heard that one of the reserves, it's Oasis Araripe, they now get $1,000, is it $1,000? $1,000 a month from the municipality for their water resource protection. So something that was perceived as wouldn't work, it doesn't work here, I don't know why it works there, can work. And we can go in all of these different elements, but there are different venues that we could look into. Yes, and that's better to have tried and failed than to have never tried at all. Something that we should also be very aware of is this, this is subjective, but we all know there's a donor preference trend. And so when we're looking at supporting projects and that, and maybe we don't have all the money to support everything they need to do, but we should, when we're doing a big land acquisition, which is right there up the top, I don't think anyone would argue with that, we should think about looking at the ones on the bottom and fitting them in, and talking to the organizations that, do they need a vehicle? Will they need contingency funds, reserve management, endowments, and trying to fit that in, and not, reforestation, I think you could let the partners go and find reforestation money. They're going to be able to find that. But that's something to keep in mind. So right there in the book, we have a checklist. And I think when you're talking to a partner, and as we mentioned how they're putting the minimum, one of the first things to do is really ask them, okay, here's your thanks. I got your reserve budget. This is wonderful. Are you going to need any housing? Are you going to need any fencing? Are you going to need to improve your roads? Will you need a vehicle? And sit down and I bet you that each one would say yes. But and why did you put it in? Well, we were afraid if we put a vehicle in, we thought you wouldn't give us money to buy that reserve. So we can be proactive in this and almost use this list, given that we have so many reserves that have shown that these are costs that are going to come up. Use this as a checklist to talk to the partner, the organization. I heard thrown around 30% of the budget should be for sustainability or for protection, and I was kind of toying with numbers and seeing if if it really works like that. And the reality is that it doesn't, because if you're buying a massive area, then your protection and sustainability would be a much smaller chunk of that pie. And when you're buying a much smaller area that's cheaper, it's amazing. But if the area goes up 10 times, the costs of protection and sustainability seem to go up about 3 times. So sort of an argument why bigger land purchase is better. So I couldn't come up with a nice, easy little, it should be 30% of our budget or something like that. What we're recommending as a process is kind of the measuring conservation in 10 years, but it's a 9-year model. So what I've been doing is working with the organization. This is what the book is about. Part of it is creating a plan where you reevaluate every 3 years. So it's a 9-year plan. And that's because some of these things might fail. And because 2-year plans, often you need the first year to sort of raise the money to do some of these things. So one thing is that the whole partner needs to be involved. I worked with reserve directors, and some of them left the job and they didn't pass on any information. So I've learned from that. So the idea would be that you have a big meeting and you come up with your sort of 9-year plan, the goal where you want to be, and then you look at where you want to be in 3 years. So you've basically come up with 2 of these pies, where you want to be in 9 years and where you hope to be in 3 years, and you evaluate that. And I'll just say here on plans, I really like plans and I hate 80-page plans. We had a species-specific species action plan for the blue-throated macaw. It was like an 80-page plan. There were 3 pages in the back, and there was a table of high, medium, and low priorities. And that is pretty much all I used for the last 4 years. Really, there's no point in these, 6-month deep. I don't see them. I think you can put it all down in like a 5-page little plan, but definitely get the NGO to work with it and have an objective. So I think the partners are going to have no problem with supporting sustainable activities. And it's also about the public. How does the public perceive it? And I think what we should be doing is just using sustainability, making that sort of the idea, talking about sustainable reserves as something that's happening, something that we should be shooting for, sort of a goal. I'm just making these up, right? Obviously, but I mean, here is sort of the idea that it's news, and if the public starts talking about sustainability, gets aware, if potential donors start understanding that there's purchasing the reserve and then there is achieving a sustainable reserve, then I think it will be better supported and start becoming sort of something that people are interested in. And then looking at it can be also used as benchmarks to as a newsworthy item. Exactly, like maybe an organization would be willing to support agroforestry for sustainability of reserves. So that's the take-home message right there. If we can if everyone, when we think about reserves, we think land purchase, protection, sustainability. And we are open to organizations talking about their sustainability element. We're asking them what are they thinking about sustainability, and then we're talking about that to the public. And that's it.